Welcome, everybody, to the Dad's Doomsday Guide. Today, we're talking to Dr. Edward Kelly. Dr. Kelly is currently a professor in the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, with an extensive resume researching the mind-brain relationship, emphasizing phenomena that challenge current neuroscientific dogma. Dr. Kelly is a graduate of both Harvard and Yale universities and co-author of the books Irreducible Mind, Beyond Physicalism, and Consciousness Unbound, all of which you can find on Amazon. Welcome, Dr. Kelly. Thank you for coming on.
My pleasure.
I guess to kick things off, I don't know, it kind of differs from person to person, but for someone in your field, how do you define consciousness? Because I know some people go, oh, it's a state of being aware and awake, and you can be unconscious while you're asleep. And then there's but in terms of kind of the overall definition that people seem to be debating about and studying, how do you define that and set the stage for us a little bit?
Well, to be honest, I don't really worry about that too much. I think that sort of comes at the end of inquiry rather than the beginning. We can do what we need to do scientifically just by taking the everyday common sense point of view. It's what goes away when you go to sleep and comes back when you have a vivid dream or wake up in the morning. And the part that's most interesting for me in my line of work is unusual states of consciousness that tend to come together with ability to do various unusual things, paranormal things like perform successfully in controlled experimental parapsychology tasks like an ESP task or a psychokinesis task, PK, things like that.
What would be, I guess, on the flip side of that, the idea of physicalism, materialism? Because I know that's kind of two worldviews there that kind of butt up against each other, and something that you've kind of looked into. Because I've always kind of grown up, and I guess the term was materialism more, and I think you coined more of a physicalism. Are those one and the same?
Yeah, they're pretty much the same. Physicalism is a sort of a ascetic, philosophical version of the materialism of the last several centuries. It's been kind of boiled down and purified. It's the kind of worldview that you and I'm sure, and most of us who are not physicists have grown up with. You know, it says basically that everything is determined in the end by physical facts alone. That is, reality consists at bottom of some kind of little self-existent bits that fly around under the influence of fields of force in accordance with mathematical laws, and everything else has to be built out of that basic stuff, whatever it is. It used to be atoms, then subatomic particles and so on. And in particular, we're really nothing more than just immensely complicated biological machines. Everything that we do, everything in mind and consciousness itself is manufactured by neurophysiological processes going on in our brains, or is somehow identical to or supervenient upon those neurophysiological things. So when we die and the brain decays, we go too, necessarily. If this picture is correct, there can't possibly be any postmortem survival. And on a more global kind of scale, looking around, we see no sign of final causes or purpose, no sign of anything transcendental in nature. The more we learn about the universe, as physicist Steven Weinberg once said famously, the more it seems pointless. That's a pretty bleak view of things, but it is the received wisdom, really, of opinion elites all over the planet, not just most mainstream scientists, including in particular people like psychologists and neuroscientists that I deal with on a regular basis. But it's even invaded the humanities, even things like religious studies. It's the prevailing doctrine. And we happen to believe that it's not only incomplete, which nobody could deny, but at bottom false. And also, and this is a long conversation, and I'm not terribly well equipped to participate in it, but I do feel, along with a lot of other people, that some of our huge planetary problems are a direct consequence of the prevalence of this kind of a world picture. So what my colleagues and I have been advocating, along with a lot of other people, is that we need a expanded science. We're not abandoning science. We need to expand science in such a way as to enable it to explain a whole bunch of things that it can't deal with in its present form.
Now, do you notice much pushback from the traditional materialistic scientific community when you've done this research? I mean, is there kind of more? I mean, I've watched several interviews recently. I was going down the rabbit hole of consciousness, and it's like a very deep, deep rabbit hole. Because even people who start to kind of not abandon the materialist view, but now they're kind of opening themselves up to, I forget the gentleman's name, but I think he's one of the ones kind of given credit for like the hard problem of consciousness. I forget his name.
Chalmers.
Yeah, Chalmers. And so he gets a little more, seems metaphysical with stuff and how consciousness might be everywhere. Yeah, and it's very interesting. Now, do you find that becoming more and more prominent? People are open to your interpretation, or is it still physicalism is just kind of being pushed back against you guys?
I think things are starting to loosen up because I think lots of people in various disciplines are beginning to see that it can't cope with the things it needs to cope with. And consciousness is one of those things, for sure. I mean, Chalmers is famous for having sort of crystallized what he called the hard problem, that is the qualitative features of consciousness. Mm-hmm. And at this point, I think many philosophers have become persuaded that we do not at present have anything resembling a causal account of how consciousness could be created by the brain, and will probably never attain one. So that's giving a lot of people heartburn and making them kind of open to other things that point in the same direction. And let me say, too, that, I mean, the whole modern evolution of physics points in the same direction. The kind of physics that physicalism is based on is the classical physics of the late 19th century. And that, the foundations of that worldview have been shifted seismically by the advent of things like relativity and quantum theory. Mm-hmm. In fact, early in the last century, a man named Alfred North Whitehead, who's one of the philosophers that I'm interested in, and who was deeply involved in the science of that period and understood it thoroughly, was moved to create his alternative metaphysical system specifically in light of those developments in physics. And there's a whole small but growing movement out there of people interested in his philosophy as one of the possible ways of expanding science in order to account for lots of other kinds of human experience.
Mm-hmm. Now, were you ever in this camp yourself? As in,
well, for sure. When I was a graduate student, I was a physicalist, not a sort of carefully thought out, committed, philosophically sophisticated physicalist. It was just kind of the atmosphere that we operated in graduate school. Everybody just took that for granted, that's how things are. The physicists are working all this stuff out. But for our purposes, that's the picture that we believe in. And I should say, Scott, also, I don't know what your history is in this regard, but I never really found much in Catholicism that appealed to me. My older sister was very different. She was really into it, as many Catholics, of course, are. But for me, the first day I got to college was when I abandoned, the faith, essentially. I mean, I'd kind of emotionally abandoned it years before, but I no longer had to, go to church on Sunday with the family and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I was an early convert to physicalism and stayed that way until just about the end of graduate school. I was working on a dissertation. It had to do with trying to recognize the main senses of high-frequency words in English with a computer by sort of looking around in the immediate neighborhood of where the word appeared. And I had gotten to a point with that project. I mean, it was moderately useful for automated content analysis, computer analysis of texts. But I had become convinced, because of my experience in that project, that no computer is ever going to understand the difference between literal truth, metaphorical truth, and literal falsehood. That is, because that distinction requires an ability to grasp meanings. And no computer then, and I think no computer now, has that ability, really. They can do lots of surprising and useful things, but really understanding language is not one of them. So I was really quite discouraged. This was my career path. I'm firm believer in the computational theory of the mind. The brain is just some kind of fancy organic computer, a meat computer, as Marvin Minsky used to call it. Mm-hmm. And I had lost my faith in that project. And right about then, I got a call from my mother, who informed me that my older sister, this very spiritual kind of person, had become a medium. That is, a person who goes into some kind of a funny state and seems to receive communications from some other department of reality. It might be dead persons or, some kind of higher wisdom sort of thing. And of course, there's an enormous literature of this stuff. This was quite a shock to my mother, and I think she was quite worried that my sister was in deep water psychologically. So she figured, my son is here, he's a graduate student in psychology. He ought to know all about this. And that's why she was calling, clearly. Anyway, I didn't have any idea what she was talking about. But I went to look, and I discovered right away that William James, one of my heroes, had spent literally a big part of his adult life studying this subject. And not only that, but there was a big shelf full of journal issues where people were doing experiments, these parapsychological experiments, using the same kind of methods that we were being taught to use for conventional psychological purposes. Mm-hmm. And it was clear to me that if these results were correct, that this was something really important, because they clearly conflict with that prevailing physicalist worldview. Indeed, I mean, the fact that they conflict is one of the reasons attracting so much negative attention to the field from scientists. Mm-hmm. They just presume, well, that's impossible, so there must be some mistake in the work. And I started sort of reading quietly into the subject, became convinced first that it's important, second that, it really looks like these results are for real. So I worked out a deal to go down and work with J.B. Rhine at his parapsychology laboratory in Durham, North Carolina. He had been in the psychology department at Duke for many years, had just recently retired and moved across the street into his own little research shop. And so I went down there, and I'd been there maybe a month when I met a guy who had these kind of abilities in spades. And he quickly erased any remaining doubts I had about the reality of these phenomena. And in fact, let me just say, if people listening to this take nothing else from it, you can take from it and to the bank the fact that these kinds of phenomena do exist as facts of nature, and science will have to expand in some way that allows it to explain them. At present, they're anomalous. But these are the kinds of things that cause science to grow historically.
Absolutely.
That's why they should be interesting.
Yeah, I know, right? It's weird. You get this odd sense of, and I want to kind of get into kind of how you studied this thing when you talk about this gentleman who exhibited mm-hmm. these abilities. Because a lot of people, even today, like you'll come across, like I found a quote from Sam Harris, and I feel like he kind of echoes a lot of that side's pushback against it. He seems a little more open to it, or at least he says he's open to it. The psi phenomenon, clairvoyance, telepathy. But he is saying that these, I guess, departures from randomness aren't enough to convince him in these studies that something's actually occurring. And then if it was so overwhelmingly provable, it would be really easy in a lab to say, oh, this person's reading this person's mind, this person's telling the future about this and whatnot. How do you respond to that? And is that representative right now still of kind of the attitude toward these studies that are being done?
Well, that's kind of the prevailing attitude, and it's amplified by the fact that there are a number of people who've made a good living, a career basically, out of trying to dump on parapsychology. Mm-hmm. But the general level of quality in that skepticism is pretty low. Sam Harris, I've met him. He's a good guy. I like him a lot. He's a very able person. He's interested in rebirth.
Oh,
He's
interesting.
practicing meditator and stuff like that, is familiar with the Southeast Asian religious traditions. And he takes Ian Stevenson's work on rebirth cases in particular quite seriously. I know that. But he obviously doesn't know very much about the experimental literature in parapsychology. I mean, just to give you an example, this guy that I met, he came to us by way of one of my undergraduate teachers in psychology who had discovered him at Yale. He was at the time a first-year law student there. Anyway, he found first-year law quite unpleasant and had sort of wandered around trying to find places where he felt more comfortable. Met this professor, former professor of mine, who knew that I was now working at the Rhine Lab and directed him down to us. So he comes into the Rhine Lab, into the library, and all the staff are arranged around the table, big library table. And on the table is a device which had been built by the current director of research, a guy named Helmut Schmidt, who had been a physicist at Boeing for many years. Anyway, Helmut had built this thing in his spare time, kind of. It was a box. It was smaller than a laptop, maybe, I don't know how to describe it, like a screen the size of a screen on a laptop, but about 4 inches thick, let's say.
Okay.
And on the top of it were 4 colored lights and 4 correspondingly colored buttons arranged side by side. And the subject's task is to push the button corresponding to the light that would be picked by the machine as a target. Now, it turned out that was a more than usually complicated process, because what happened was that there was a switch stepping through the 4 positions at megahertz or something like that. And after the subject pushed the button, that spinning would be interrupted by the arrival of a particle from a radioactive substance inside the device. The most random process that we know of in nature. And in the absence of a subject, this thing exemplified the statistical laws governing that situation. Now, Helmut, it turned out, had spent a lot of time looking for people who could do better than that, and had found 2 or maybe 3, I can't quite remember, who could do a little better, like 27% instead of the expected 25%, but over a long series of trials. So that accumulates statistically. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, they could do it in the direction that Helmut asked them, that is, either excess hits or fewer hits than expected by chance. The latter is a thing called psi missing, and it's a very interesting phenomenon in itself. Anyway, in comes this guy, sits down in the library, points to the box, and what's that? So Helmut explained it to him. Okay. So he then began to tell us his kind of life story, and every so often he'd reach out and push a button. And it quickly became evident that he was doing a good bit better than 25%. And I noticed Helmut his eyes were starting, archetypal German scientist, pale blue eyes, high forehead.
Yeah.
Physicist by training. And so he was getting very interested. Anyway, make a long story short, at the end of the hour, this person had accumulated 180 hits in 508 trials, which is a bit over 35%. Mm-hmm. Way better than Helmut had ever seen before. And when you do the math on that, the chance of that happening to get a score that good or better in that number of trials by chance amounts to something like 1 in 10 million.
Jeez.
In other words, we could have sat there for 10 million hours. We might have expected to sit there before seeing something like that happen by chance.
Wow.
10 million hours. Oh, yeah, and just to give you an idea of how sort of careful Helmut is, turns out that inside the box, there is a duplicate set of counters. So he immediately took the device off to his lab and opened it up to make sure that the inside counters had the same numbers on them that the outside did, that this guy hadn't sort of hypnotized everybody and changed the behavior of the box.
Now, how I'm sorry, but when you look at somebody like this gentleman, how rare is that ability? So when he comes into the office, I mean, if you look at all the data from all your research over all the years, how common is somebody like him?
He's very rare.
Okay.
I think there are lots more than we know about, but in terms of persons like that who have come into labs, they're I mean, yeah, this is a big subject actually within parapsychology. And I'm very strongly at one end of the conversation. Lots of parapsychologists, like lots of psychologists, would like to think that people are kind of more or less the same for purposes of their experiments.
Mm-hmm.
But I view these psychic abilities in the context of other kinds of rare skills and think there is virtually no point in doing experiments with unselected subjects. You know, if you want to study some tremendous athletic ability or creative ability, there's no point in using randomly selected undergraduates. Find people who exemplify the skills that you're interested in and work with them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's clear that these are the distribution is not a normal distribution like that of intelligence, let's say, but it's more like an exponential thing where most people have practically none. And then as the amount increases, there are fewer and fewer until way out at the end, you got a very small number of people with a lot of ability. Those are the kinds of people that I want to study.
Have you found that those people tend to hide this ability? Or are they kind of like, are they scared of it? Or do they, I mean, because you see a lot of people online, and we kind of touched on it before we started recording, the social media world, the things we've posted about the paranormal, and people tend to gravitate toward that. And people, I mean, there's a lot of, and not to disparage anyone, but there's a lot of people who are either mentally kind of unwell and think things are going on when they're not, and a whole bunch of other factors.
Mm-hmm.
The people who actually have that ability that you've seen studying in a lab, are they apprehensive to pursue that or to expose that as being something that's happening
I think
to them?
it depends a good bit on their kind of life experience.
Mm-hmm.
I've certainly heard lots of stories from people who have ability about discovering quite early that they were different somehow from other people, and that it would be smart to keep quiet about it because when they spoke up, they got bad feedback, you know, from their parents or friends or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
When people come to me asking about potential careers in this field, I have to be honest with them and tell them, you know, this is still in many academic institutions, this is taboo stuff, and you can ruin your prospects for an academic career by getting involved with it. On the other hand, I do believe that things are starting to break down now, and that it will become acceptable fairly soon because of these larger changes. We're no longer so isolated. You know, it used to be that psychologists and neuroscientists could somewhat realistically say that, hey, you know, we're doing great on everything except this parapsychology stuff. So let's put that off in a corner, you know, sort of quarantine and isolate it and hope it'll go away.
Yeah.
Well, that's no longer possible. That was the whole point, really, of book number 1, Irreducible Mind. I don't know if you can see that properly.
Yeah. No, I could see it.
You probably know about Esalen out on the West Coast there. Up south of San Francisco near Big Sur on the Route 1 on a fantastic part of the California coast.
Beautiful.
It was co-created by Mike Murphy back in 1959 or something like that. Well, Mike is an extraordinary person in many ways, but one of the things he's done with Esalen, I mean, it's mostly known as a place where all kinds of workshops go on, many of which are quite sort of wild and far out sort of things. They were all involved in the early psychedelic days of the 60s and stuff like that. All kinds of encounter groups of extreme sorts, lots of wild stuff. But there's also a very serious intellectual aspect to Esalen. Mike has a thing he now calls the Center for Theory and Research, under the umbrella of which he, who's an extremely smart and well-read person, has pursued a lot of his personal intellectual interests. So he kind of gets an allowance from Esalen, which allows him to host these conferences or groups that he forms to pursue particular interests of his. And in 1998, he created a new fellowship, which was intended to look at the existing evidence for postmortem survival. Now we're getting closer to the core interest for this event. Mike, you see, understood perfectly that if physicalism is true, there is no possibility of survival, period. But he also knew that there are a number of people, not many, but scattered around the planet, who are doing various kinds of research that seem to provide evidence suggestive that survival may actually occur. And these include things, for example, like these cases of the reincarnation type, rebirth cases, some of the mediumistic literature, studies of crisis apparitions, and one I'll talk a little more about later, certain kinds of near-death experience, particular ones that occur under really extreme physiological conditions. So Mike decided, well, let's find out what this is all about. And so he convened one of these groups, and my wife and I both went to it. And so we spent the way these things work is the meetings go from like Sunday night to Thursday night or Friday morning at Esalen. And they're very intense. I mean, a lot takes place. So we spent our first 2 years presenting and talking about the various lines of evidence seemingly supportive of survival. And by the end of that time, we had decided that we were really all anti-physicalism, and we wanted to do something more intense ourselves. That is, to really launch a full-scale attack on physicalism from within science. We saw that it would have to proceed in 2 stages. The first stage would be to assemble in one place a lot of evidence showing the limitations of physicalism, that is, its inability to handle various kinds of actually occurring human capacities, psychophysical capacities, mental capacities of one sort or another. And that was the main purpose of Irreducible Mind. And we modeled it after a book that had been published in 1903 by one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research, which took place in England in 1882. This guy's name was Frederick Myers, a neglected genius of psychology, in my opinion. And in his book, he had, as we were planning to do, identified a number of phenomena that he thought contradicted the materialism, the rising materialism of that late 19th century time period. So our basic plan was to revisit a lot of his phenomena and some other ones too, in light of a subsequent century of scientific, mostly published in biomedical literature, research. And the net of it, we concluded, was to show that Myers was on the right track. Now, what you have to do here is, well, let me go back a little further. This is kind of basic mind-body talk, but it's important. Physicalist idea, of course, is that everything is manufactured by physiology in the brain, or equivalent to it, or something of that sort. And that's a very difficult doctrine to attack directly. And let me give you an example of why. Let's say, now, everybody recognizes and agrees that there are normally strong correlations between things going on in the mind and things going on in the brain. And the possibility of physical causation of mental things is unambiguously clear. You get hit on the head hard enough, or take some LSD or grow a tumor in your brain, mental things change. Physical can affect the mental. What about the other way? I decide to raise my hand, and up it goes. That looks to me like mental causation. Why not? Well, physicalist says you've misunderstood what's really going on here. Because, you see, that idea or impulse that you experienced is really nothing more than a pattern of neural activity in your brain. Physical causes physical, no problem. Now, the way to defeat that argument is to identify things that cannot be done by the unaided brain. And that's what the empirical part of Irreducible Mind is all about. First on any list of that sort has to be all these psi phenomena, because the conflict is so clear. The conflict is most clear if there is survival. So what's the state of that whole conversation? Basically, I mean, it's remarkable. There's a lot of evidence for it. We're not talking about just, a few anecdotes or something like this. We're talking about a couple 100,000 pages of serious scientific literature developed by really able people, starting back in the time of William James and F.W.H. Myers.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, there continues to be a discussion within the field of psychical research about what it all really adds up to. Because in many cases, it's clear that there's an alternative way of thinking about apparent evidence for survival. And that is that it might involve only psi in living persons. So, for example, if a medium seems to be bringing forward your Uncle Joe, who died last year, let's say, and there he is, seemingly talking in his usual sort of uncouth manner or whatever, referring to things that you know about because you spent time with him and that sort of stuff. Is it not possible that the medium is somehow dredging this information up from somewhere and sort of impersonating Joe? This is the so-called living agent hypothesis. And it turns out to be very hard to decisively rule out that possibility. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there are some parts of the evidence can be understood that way. I personally think that will not cover all the evidence, and I've come to believe, partly for reasons I'll get to in a moment, personally come to believe that survival is not only possible, but probable.
Okay.
Now, fortunately, that dilemma doesn't have to be resolved in order for all this stuff to count against physicalism, because either horn of that dilemma is problematic for physicalism. So in our book, we just, not wanting it to be a parapsychology book, we incorporated the entire literature, 140 years or whatever it was at that time, of both research on everything from spontaneous cases to field and interview studies and experimental studies. And on the experimental side, there are now thousands of published experiments. They're not all successful. You'd be suspicious if there were.
Yeah.
But enough are successful, some extremely so, to, I think, make an overwhelmingly compelling case for the reality of the phenomenon. Okay, that's not where the subject stops. And we covered a bunch of things in our book. We have a big chapter first on extreme psychophysiological influence. And this was written by my wife, Emily, who may appear in the background here at some point. She starts with the sort of ambiguous stuff, generic placebo effects and things like that, and then works progressively toward things that are more and more specific and hard to account for in physiological terms. So out in the far end of that spectrum are things like stigmata, in the Catholic faith.
Padre Pio, right?
Yeah, Padre Pio is one good case. There are hundreds of them, literally, in which people have a fervent kind of imagination and commitment and an imaginative involvement with the crucifixion of Christ, develop marks on their bodies corresponding to the wounds as they understood them to be. That's one of the interesting parts about it, that, the spear wound might be in a slightly different place depending on where that particular person thought it happened.
Oh, that's interesting.
And there's all that stuff, about whether the nails were in the palms or in the wrists and that kind of thing. Mm. So there are those. There are related things in the hypnosis literature. For example, the production of blisters that have a specific geometric shape, even though nothing was done that could have produced that blister in a normal way. So Janet, for example, would occasionally say to one of his highly hypnotizable subjects in a hypnotic state, "I'm now going to touch you with this red hot poker," and he'd show them the poker that has a little star-shaped thing at the end, and he'd touch it to the skin of the shoulder, let's say. And lo and behold, within a few minutes, a star-shaped blister would arise in that place. Now, we understand exactly, or in great detail, really, how the blister would arise in the normal situation where something really hot is applied to the skin. But we have no idea how the brain, unaided could cause that blister to form on the skin in the absence of that, burn.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a really interesting segment of the hypnosis literature that has to do with pain control. A man named Esalen in India did surgeries. This was just before the rise of ether anesthesia. He did his surgeries under hypnosis. And he did like 1,000 or more of these things. The descriptions are absolutely blood chilling. I mean, he talks about, I inserted a knife at the corner of his mouth, drew it to his ear, across to the eye, peeled back the skin, and pus rushed out. Oh, I mean,
yeah, it's kind of
that just makes you shiver to read the stuff. And the patient moaned softly.
Oh.
Imagine having that done to you in your normal state.
Yeah, geez. No thanks.
Ironically, I mean, the response to this of a guy who was very opposed to the idea that there's anything special about the hypnotic state is, well, the patient had a strong desire to please his surgeon.
Okay. Yeah,
literally,
you said
that's the kind of stuff. Yeah. Okay. Another interesting case actually involved one in which a woman, a Russian woman living in Germany at the time, or in Paris, I forget where, was able to produce what looked like writing in her skin. It was not on the skin, but in the skin, apparently involving capillaries in some way. And among other things, the writing that appeared was sometimes a reproduction of a target that had been put out for her in the next room or somewhere out of sight.
Weird.
Yeah, it is weird. And it attracted the attention of two French physiologists, one being a very prominent doctor, and the other guy, a man named Charles Richet, who actually won a Nobel Prize for discovering anaphylaxis and how to fix that.
Oh.
So they studied this woman in some detail. And their conclusion, interestingly enough, was that it must involve some unknown capacity of this capillary system. There must be some neural regulation of it that we just don't know about yet, but probably will. And the interesting point about that case is that we now have more than enough technological capacity to discover any such control system if it existed, and it's not there. Okay. So this woman was somehow directly causing this thing to happen in her skin.
So would a physicalist or a materialist, when they were confronted with something like that, with evidence like that, what is their initial reaction? Just, oh, there's something physiologically going on that we just don't know yet, or stress or something?
Probably, if they'd even bother to read it, I mean, the main response of most scientists, it's not, I mean, you have to say I understand, scientists are typically very busy people. They're struggling with their own, narrow scientific interests. And who wants to go read another, 100,000 pages of experimental literature or something like that? So they get their opinions elsewhere, and they tend to get them either from the headlines in the National Enquirer as they go through the checkout line at the supermarket, or from one of these public critics of the subject who tell them, don't worry about it, it's all junk, forget it.
Would you say that most people that you come across who object to this being possible haven't even looked at the literature and are just piggybacking off of what other people have said?
Yeah.
That's really unfortunate, because like for me, I had no idea this was even being studied at a university level by serious people. And then when I came across you guys in the University of Virginia, I was like, oh my God, like this is actually looked at in a scientific way. But you would never guess that, like you said, from reading tabloids at the supermarket, or, hearing the most prominent, scientists out there talking about how there's zero chance of this happening. Just give us time and we'll explain everything through current scientific understanding. Yeah. And I feel like that's such a non-scientific view and so anti-science. I'm like, why not just be open to this stuff? At least read it and then make up your mind or debate about it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's astonishing to me that the overwhelming reaction among scientists is this kind of wish to be rid of the subject, when to me, it's just so obviously of scientific interest that if these phenomena really occur, then we got to make some changes in some of our basic ideas. And that's a challenge and exciting rather than a threat.
Yeah.
For many scientists, this physicalism stuff, it's a secular faith. It's a new kind of religion. And we get treated like heretics. There are people who would like to burn us at the stake if they could get away with it. Literally.
Well, Do you still have that kind of headbutting against people, or has it calmed down, or you still do?
Well, let me give an example. A very prominent social psychologist named Darrell Bem, over a period of years, worked out various procedures for testing for kind of low-level psi abilities in mostly undergraduates using very standardized procedures of various kinds. And he eventually published, there were 9 series of experiments, and he submitted a paper to a very prominent psychology journal, one of the best in the field, certainly, where it was intensively reviewed in the normal way. Well, word got out that this paper was about to be published, and there was a stream of letters to the New York Times from very prominent people. I mean, including people like Doug Hofstadter, saying things like, if this were true, all of science would crash to the ground. It can't be true. We shouldn't be allowing this stuff even to go on. I mean, it was that kind of stuff. It's been written about. There have been lots of replications now, and a fair proportion of the replications failed, but a sizable proportion succeeded too. It's got a good track record, that whole paradigm.
And it's, I mean, you see it, I saw it a lot when because I loved, and we discussed this too, is we, both raised Catholic, and then you kind of get into the philosophy and you get into the debates between, theists and disbelievers. And it gets, you quickly find that people are so entrenched with their side and what they believe and what they've come to understand that they're just unwilling to open up to the other side and to see across. And it's really unfortunate with science. And you've kind of seen a little bit with the UFO kind of phenomenon. I don't know what you feel about that, but there's very prominent scientists coming out and just immediately saying, no, it's BS. This isn't possible. It's not happening. But then you have someone like, I think his name is Avi Loeb, who's like, oh, let's study it. Let's be open to it. And if there's nothing there, there's nothing there. It's like, just look at it. And it's shocking. It's shocking to see. He's like one of the few that has that perception of the problem. It's like, just figure out what it is, study it. And to see that across all these things that don't fit into the narrow view of what we've understood about it. And it's like, oh, well, science will figure it out later. Well, it's like, well, maybe science isn't equipped yet to even measure this stuff. And it's like, they won't even have that conversation. We're like a prisoner of what is filtered down to us. And I don't think, and someone in your position probably gets, people probably try to stop people like me from looking at people like you to get this information. It's like, oh, this is all crazy. Don't look at that. 2
places worth jotting down. One is our place, DOPS, the Division of Perceptual Studies. You can get to our website just Googling DOPS UVA.
Okay.
You can also go, and I recommend this even more strongly, to tell you the truth. Go to the Society for Psychical Research in the UK, and they have on their website an evolving encyclopedia of psychical research. And that's a place where you can get accurate information, unlike Wikipedia.
Yeah.
I'm serious. Wikipedia, they've got a whole subgroup attached to that operation that seems to do nothing other than scan for psychical research, trying to raise its ugly head in their system and kill it. Yeah.
Really?
It's full of misinformation.
Wow. I knew that about Wikipedia just in general, like people who always get their information from there. It's like, well, that's not very, very accurate.
But I want to know the atomic number of, selenium or something like that, it's okay. But if it's anything with a charge to it, be careful.
I did. I was not aware of that. How did you come to, was it just you've noticed a certain behavior coming from them?
And in various discussion lists I belong to, people would cite examples of their just hideous treatment of some person or subject.
Man.
Yeah, it's appalling that they get away with that.
It's scary because I think that permeates everything in society now, is just the information flow and how people are actively trying to stop you from getting the information if it goes against what the mainstream narrative is, whatever it is. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist or anything, but the older I've gotten, I realize just how limited or how controlled, speech is, the freedom of it, expressing different ideas. Like if it runs counter to something, you better be careful. And if it's, like you said, has a charge to it, you might not be getting what you think you're getting. And it's concerning for people like me because I'm not always people aren't aware of that stuff all the time.
Yeah, for sure.
I want to talk a little bit about when you talk about the psychic abilities and people having those and it being kind of rare from a religious perspective. And we talked to an exorcist recently, and I think you mentioned in one of your other emails that you had lunch with Father John Nicola, I believe is how you pronounce his name.
Mm-hmm.
And how is your view when they get into like any kind of psychic ability is due to demonic influence,
Mm-hmm.
evil nature? Now, in all your studies, all your research, people with this seems to have this ability. How does evil fit into all this with you? How does kind of that religious background that you have fit into all this? Is it just total, you just don't believe any of it? Is it just like kind of constructed in terms of like, control with society? How do you come down on this? And have you ever, I don't know, looked into like that whole darker side of what this power comes from, apparently?
Oh boy.
Not to get too out there,
That's a really tough one. I'd kind of like to return to it later on sometime when we talk more about what all this kind of leads to in terms of a revised worldview. But let me just insert a brief account of the meeting that I had with John Nicola. This was arranged by the same guy who sent that person down to us. He came and
knows
actually
some interesting. He knows some good people.
Oh yeah, he spent a sabbatical with us in Durham the following year, and it was during that time that he arranged for this lunch to occur. Anyway, we sat with this guy who had been sort of the main East Coast guy in this area. And as I remember the conversation, I don't have the notes in front of me or anything. He said he had been involved in his career in over 1,000 such cases in which people had come to him with questions about whether exorcism was appropriate. He said 90% of those cases were some kind of garden variety psychopathology, period. Nothing paranormal of any kind. Most of the rest, he thought, involved paranormal elements, but nothing plausibly demonic. On the fingers of one hand, however, he had him involved in cases that led him to take this demonic stuff seriously, in which, the classic things happen. This small child begins exclaiming that he's the devil in Latin, or does his projectile vomiting, that kind of stuff. I mean, it raises the hair on the back of my neck even now. I don't really know what to think of it. I've not looked into it in any detail, but boy, I do remember that conversation. Yeah, as I'm sure you know, the whole problem of evil is really right in the center of contemporary theological discussions, trying to avoid making evil the responsibility of God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If God is all powerful, then he could stop it if he wanted to.
Yeah.
Or stop us from doing it.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's get back to that because it comes out right at the end.
Sure.
I'd like to go back to more of the phenomena that we discussed in Irreducible Mind.
Okay.
Then we have a chapter on what are called psychological automatisms and secondary centers of consciousness. This includes things like cases of multiple personality, and in particular, ones in which the secondary personality is kind of unknown to the primary personality, but may have abilities of various kinds that greatly exceed those of the everyday personality.
That's interesting.
If personality A is the everyday one and B is the normally kind of hidden one that comes out from time to time, there are several things here that are difficult for conventional neuroscience. A and B may exist concurrently, for example, at the same time. And you can show that because B reports things that happen to A. And yet both are using skills that are believed to be exercised by particular brain areas. So these two different centers of consciousness can simultaneously somehow be using, according to the conventional view, the linguistic capacities of the brain, which are organized in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
But it's that asymmetry, the overlap and asymmetry of consciousness that's most problematic for the conventional picture. Next on our list came near-death experiences. And this has some immediate connections with your main line of interest. One of the earliest publications about NDEs was that of a Swiss mountaineer who took a dive off one of the Alps, some cliff, fell like a couple hundred feet into a snowbank. So he thought he was a goner, and on the way down had this huge experience, a near-death experience.
Okay.
Notice, by the way, that his brain was certainly in normal condition. He wasn't injured in any way, thank God. And the experience was so important to him that he started asking around among his mountaineering community and eventually found a bunch of cases that he wrote up in an article, which published in like 1890 or something like that. Heim was his name. So that's right at the beginning of the subject. That account was known to Henri Bergson, who was aware of these phenomena already at the very beginning of the 20th century. The part of that vast subject that I want to really emphasize here, and which interests me the most as a physiologist, is experiences occurring under extreme physiological conditions. These include things like the coma of Eben Alexander, although coma's a little more complicated than the others. The others are general anesthesia, which, after all, we do in order to obliterate the possibility of conscious experience. Don't always succeed at that. I mean, there are some people actually wake up in the ordinary way, with being hacked upon and unable to do anything, even to express. You can't even scream. You're paralyzed. That's part of the.
I've heard of a few of those stories, and that's just, oh man, terrible.
No
terrible.
Thanks. There's at least one case in the literature, by the way, of a person who has experienced both. That is, the abnormal awakening, which was hideous, and a NDE, which was blissful in the typical sort of way. The other circumstance, even more extreme, it's really general anesthesia and or cardiac arrest. Cardiac arrest can occur out on the street somewhere, but it can also occur during surgical procedures under general anesthesia.
Okay.
So the point here is that there is a very strong consensus among contemporary neuroscientists about the conditions necessary for conscious experience. And they have to do basically with a brain that is in condition to generate large-scale patterns of neuroelectric activity, having frequencies in the range from, say, 8 or 10 to maybe 70 or 80 hertz. So high-frequency stuff. That's what's obliterated rapidly by general anesthesia and cardiac arrest. And yet, there are cases, and they are not uncommon, in which people are not only having conscious experiences, but having the most intense and transformative conscious experiences of their entire lives. Some of these are extremely well documented. You probably heard about the case of Pam Reynolds, who underwent this hypothermic cardiac arrest procedure.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. It's more complicated than it's often described as being, but it's a good case. Not perfect. None of these cases is perfect. But here's the real point. This stuff is coming right out of the absolute heartland of contemporary biomedical technology. We're getting better at recovering people from the borderlands of death, and we're finding more and better cases of this sort regularly.
Interesting point regarding the NDEs is that I've always questioned this, and I don't know if I'm sure you've thought about this, is like when people start trying to explain it from natural causes, materialistic causes, and there's something going on in the brain that we just can't measure yet, but it's not completely flatlined, or there's something going on, and they try to come up with different things. Now, assuming that our technology is good enough to know whether or not there's some activity in the brain going on or not, or maybe one day we get something that says, there's all this going on we didn't know about. Barring that from happening, I've thought about, from an evolutionary point of view, what would be the purpose of having a blissful, the most real experience ever, seeing people from the afterlife, getting factual information that you later confirm. If you're trying to explain this away through a natural phenomenon, I've struggled with there being a substantial or good enough reason why this would be naturally occurring. What would be the purpose of nature kind of producing this kind of effect if someone's dying? Have you thought about that? Have you, I guess, tried to, steel man, the other side's argument? I mean, what's the best argument that this could be something other than of a supernatural experience, I guess?
I don't feel any obligation to try and understand this in evolutionary terms.
Mm-hmm.
I'm more interested in focusing on the biology.
Mm-hmm.
And let me just say that the key point about these special cases is that people can correctly report things that took place during the period of apparent unconsciousness. These are time anchors, that they were having the experience at the time when their brains were impaired.
Mm-hmm.
That's one aspect. I mean, they might report things that were going on in the operating theater that they could have seen if they were wide awake in the regular way. But lots of times, people's eyes are taped, but they report seeing things, or their ears they're being pumped full of tone bursts to monitor their brainstem function, but they hear, someone whispering to somebody else in the theater, or they see something going on in a room down the hall from the theater. Mm-hmm. What most people have tried to do who want to dispute this evidence is to say that it happened at some other time, not while the brain is impaired, but either before or after.
Ah, I see.
I mean, the most extreme attempt to do away with the conjunction of the impaired brain with the experience requires a parapsychological aspect. Mm-hmm. That is that, well, the person is waking up after the operation and by virtue of ESP has become aware of what took place during the operation and now tells the story. So most materialists would not like to draw upon that counter explanation. It is certainly true that in a relatively brief NDE, let's say one caused by cardiac arrest, there can be a little residual activity in the brain, not visible to an EEG. Mm-hmm. But that is no escape from these phenomena because we're clear about what kind of EEG must be present or potentially present in order to support consciousness. And that has been abolished. The fact that there could be some kind of residual activity doesn't help because it's not of the form expected to accompany consciousness. And in fact, with cardiac arrest, it's even worse than that because it isn't very long before neurons become incapable of even firing. And that's the ultimate physical basis for any kind of coherent brain activity.
And from a biology point of view, in your opinion, we pretty much have this nailed down to where yes. we know what should be happening in the brain to give conscious thought and whatnot.
You bet.
Okay, cool.
I have a paper pending right at the moment with a mainstream neuroscience journal in which I try to make this argument at the very end of a long discussion of an existing theory of consciousness. It's kind of in limbo at the moment. I'm not sure what's going to happen to it. Anyway, I expect really that this may be the area that finally forces the scientific community more broadly to take these kinds of phenomena seriously.
How close do you think we are to NDEs being accepted as something other than, we can just explain it with, it happened before, it happened after? Do you think there's a movement? Is it close or is it still just...
Well, I'm sort of reluctant to predict.
Do you think we're decades away still from some of this stuff being accepted?
It's so hard to know, because things can change very fast when we actually get to a tipping point. Mm-hmm. And I feel that we're pretty close to that point right now, more so than at any time during my career. And yet at the same time, I'm mindful that William James himself believed over a century ago that the results already in hand were sufficient to alter the trajectory of science.
So we might be looking at another century.
Yeah. I don't expect it to happen in my lifetime, let's put it that way. But I do think we're closer than we have been, and partly because we're gaining support from these other areas like physics and the philosophy of mind and consciousness and so on, which is also encountering or pushing back against the kind of naive physicalism that prevails in mainstream psychology, neuroscience, and the humanities.
What would you think would have to be discovered to convince some of these, maybe not the hardline materialists, what would have to be discovered for like an NDE? What kind of evidence do you think would need to be sufficient to where, okay, I mean, is there going to have to be something like measurable? Like when you talk about like quantum, I don't know, I'm not going to get into like things I don't understand, but is it going to have to be in that realm, kind of the more abstract realm of physics, where they can be like, oh, it opens up the possibility of this happening?
It's very hard to know. There's no such thing as a perfect experiment. Mm-hmm. People can continue to complain even about the best of experiments, that something could have been tweaked a little bit more. I personally think that what would do more than anything else to increase the acceptability of the paranormal is a scientifically viable theory that would help us to understand or explain the phenomena.
Okay.
And we'll get to that in a little bit, because I think we are making progress in that direction, or several lines of progress that may be converging. I kind of think they are. We have chapters on genius and on mystical experience. And these topics are closely interconnected. I mean, it's interesting in the world's canon, there are lots of people who have been both recognized geniuses and who also had mystical experiences. But to talk about the genius part first, there is some literature in psychology, of course, about creativity. It's the kind of watered down term. But most of it is pretty shallow stuff, I must say. And Myers has in his book, F.W.H. Myers, Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death. If only he'd left off the and its survival of bodily death, it would be more widely recognized as a great work. Anyway, he has a wonderful chapter on genius in that book, and we refer to it extensively. But we, like he, recognize that it by itself is not enough to compel abandonment of physicalism. However, it does stretch it, certainly.
How so?
And well, if you look, for example, at somebody like Ramanujan, we spent a little time on him, the Indian mathematician. This was a guy who had no formal education in mathematics to speak of. He picked up a book, when he was a teenager, and in a few years had basically recapitulated most of the history of Western mathematics and invented whole new branches of it that some people are still trying to figure out. He wrote voluminous notebooks. I mean, this guy was just something totally off the charts. He worked with a very distinguished British mathematician named Hardy, who was kind of the apostle of rigorous proof. Ramanujan was the sort of exemplar of mathematical intuition. Where did this stuff come from? Unfortunately, Hardy wasn't all that interested in that aspect of the subject. He wanted results to be proved. Only then were they for real for him. But lots of Ramanujan's results did get proved. How did he get them? Well, a lot of them came to him in dreams. In his dreams, he would meet one of his religious deities who would write in blood on a white board, write equations out, and he would sort of in his dreams watch all this stuff. Then he'd jump up and write the stuff down in his notebook. I mean, this guy's, what he did, that absolutely beggars the conceptual apparatus currently available to cognitive psychology. Mm-hmm. And we're not the only ones who have commented on that.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, I'm always curious, how rare is that level of genius?
Well, let's put it this way. Hardy himself was a very distinguished mathematician. He proposed this kind of scale of raw mathematic ability that went from 0 to 100. Mm. I'm probably near about 2 on that scale. Hardy put himself, I think, at 20 or 25. And Hilbert, the greatest mathematician of the 19th century, I think, was at 50. And then there was Ramanujan all by himself at 100.
Wow.
So
that's amazing.
Yeah.
So what's the theory about that genius, that level of genius? Is that you're getting, I mean, when you talk about the paranormal phenomenon in mind, body, brain connection, what is that? Is that just like they're tapping into another resource that we're not aware of? Is that kind of like with the theory?
That's exactly where we are headed, and we'll get back to that in just a few minutes.
Okay.
But the basic idea, and it applies to the next topic as well, mystical experience, is that we, under conditions that we know practically nothing about, can gain access to one or more levels of higher consciousness that exists somehow within us, but normally remains unknown to us and inaccessible.
And that would be kind of an argument for meditation. And would you clump in something like DMT into that as well, or no?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that both of those come up actually in connection with mystical experiences. Of course, this is another vast subject. And let me start by saying that if contemporary psychology's handling of creativity is not terribly distinguished at best, that applies in spades to its handling of mystical experiences. Very few psychologists and neuroscientists in the modern period have been willing even to discuss the subject or deal with it in any way since William James, let's say. And those who do very typically devalue and pathologize it. That's been the overwhelming response to mystical experience. I think if our books do nothing else, I hope to God they will raise the level of scientific interest in mystical experiences, because like my co-editor, Paul Marshall, who has had one himself, I think these provide windows into deeper parts of reality that are normally hidden from us and that should govern our efforts to construct a better scientifically grounded worldview. And that's what we'll get to shortly.
For the DMT, when you see people going into those states and being contacted by various entities that they feel are outside themselves, have you seen any research about that or have any opinion about what in fact they are interacting with?
Yeah, those entity things in DMT and ayahuasca and so on. That's the part I know least about. I think what is clearly established at this point is that a number of psychedelics, the classic psychedelics, can produce genuine mystical experiences of the sort that lie at or near the foundations of most of the world's religious traditions.
Okay.
That has been controversial in the past, particularly within the world of religious studies, where there were a number of scholars who were intent upon disavowing the possibility that you could have a real mystical experience by swallowing a pill.
Yeah.
and often in service of their own, theological persuasions.
Yeah, because that's what you notice a lot with the NDEs and even the DMT is that people are getting something different. Some, not all the time, but different variations. I think Ibn Alexander talked about this, is that he was born and raised, I think he was believed Christian, but he had things that were against that teaching within his. And so if it was manifested within your own beliefs and your own upbringing, it wouldn't adhere to those strict guidelines, where actually it was showing him and teaching him different things. Like I think reincarnation was one of the things that was presented to him and some other things. And so you see that with DMT a lot, is they're getting information that's life-changing, that's taking you from one path and putting you on another. And you think if it was just all manufactured with your own experiences, your own brain, it wouldn't be that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that figures prominently in the academic study of mystical experiences early on with people like James and others before him even, and then through Aldous Huxley, and particularly with a book called Mysticism and Philosophy by Walter Stace, was published originally in 1960. They took a very kind of universalizing approach toward mystical experiences, emphasizing the commonalities among reports from different cultures and persons and so on. And there was a big backlash against that in the 1970s, mainly generated by a man named Stephen Katz, who wanted to argue in terms of the differences, certainly doctrinal differences, but he took a much stronger position that even the shaping of the experience itself was totally a matter of cultural or doctrinal conditioning. But as you just pointed out, there are lots of people who have mystical experiences, without spontaneously have them, without doing anything to try and induce them. And often what happens to them conflicts with whatever prior beliefs they had.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes this happens even in, for example, small children who don't have any convictions as yet.
That's one of the most fascinating things you see, like NDEs, and the kids are saying things that are similar to adults or this similar themes. And that's mind blowing by itself too.
By the way, I just wrote a blurb for a book that's coming out sometime later this year. It's called The Next World by a man named Gregory Shushin. He's a student of comparative culture and religion, but he's very astute and very careful. And he's looked at NDEs across a tremendous diversity of settings and develops a picture in which, it's called the experiential source hypothesis, in which there really is a kind of common underlying core to the experience, or many of them. They can certainly differ, and the lines are hard to draw. But then there are, layers and layers of stuff that comes in from both the individual psychology and history of that person and the culture or ideology in which that person is embedded. Mm-hmm. So it's a very complicated phenomenon with many layers. But there is at the bottom of it all, and this applies to mystical experiences generally, something resembling a common core.
Mm-hmm.
That point has been argued for, that attitude has been argued for, not only by Gregory Shushin, but one of our colleagues, a guy named Jeff Kripal, who has a great chapter, by the way, in our last book, again, Consciousness Unbound. It's about the future of the humanities. I mean, he's been watching this play out in the humanities, where there are, half of the Society for Religious Studies, or whatever it's called, 10,000 members. They're committed physicalists whose whole thing is to find ways of reducing religious experience to some kind of physicalist type explanation in terms of, social or political power, or God knows what, all the kind of stuff that those people deal in, and avoid coming to grips with these phenomena. And, by the way, their clear historical and psychological association with the paranormal. I mean, lots of people who have mystical experiences or who are creative geniuses, and they tend to overlap a lot already, are people who also report lots of paranormal stuff going on in their lives. So all of these things seem to arise from some deeper or higher, I prefer higher rather than deeper, choose your metaphor, meditation itself. World historically, these procedures, techniques, and there are many of them. There's not just a form of meditation. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different styles and so on, traditions. But they're typically associated with an attempt to transform yourself, to become a better person, to, have higher kinds of experiences. And in one place in particular, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras has 4 books to it, the third of which is mainly amounts to a catalog of paranormal abilities of various kinds that may arise together with the intense practice of meditation. So meditation, yes, is another pathway into this territory. It's now receiving a lot more scientific attention than it has in the past. That's probably all to the good. I have to say that I don't think very much of what's happened so far. Meditation research has kind of allied itself with public health in such a way as to tap into the normal funding mechanisms for research, NIH, basically.
Oh, okay.
And Mike Murphy, who's a 50, 60, 70-year meditator himself. 70, yeah, right. Ooh. Known Mike for over 20 years now. He jokes about it as, mindfulness for hemorrhoid control. Nevertheless, I think it is inevitable. So, 90-something% of all the meditation research that is going on right now is going on in the kind of shallows of the subject, in my opinion.
Okay.
but it will inevitably begin to encounter some of these other things that come from the deep end of the pool and will gradually move in that direction. So, yeah, I think meditation research and research on psychedelics are the two pathways for increased scientific understanding of mystical experiences and, practically speaking, conditions conducive to their occurrence. That opens up the possibility of a whole applications dimension of what I'm about to tell you about theory.
Mm-hmm.
Theory. Okay, so the main consequence of irreducible mind for me was to show that there's a different way of thinking about the relationship of mind and brain from the conventional, what we call production model. That is, consciousness and mind being manufactured by neurophysiology. And this is a picture that appealed to Myers and was made more explicit, really, by James in 1897 in his Ingersoll lecture at Harvard. It was called On Two Supposed Objections to the Doctrine of Immortality. And the first was about this apparent correlation between the mind, mental, and physical events. He said, well, there's a different way to think about this. We normally think about physical as producing mental, and that's what the whole medical establishment thinks, and they still do. But maybe it's the function of the brain is rather receptive or transmissive or permissive or something like that, that it allows something to express itself which is different from the brain. The fundamental impact of irreducible mind at the level of psychology is to establish, in my opinion, that that is a plausible alternative view of how things really work. And for me, that basically removed the logical objection to survival growing out of a physicalist point of view.
Mm-hmm.
If that picture is correct, it opens a pathway for the possibility of survival. So it had a big impact on my personal kind of calibration of that issue.
Mm-hmm.
Then we started to go on right at the end of Irreducible Mind and have continued since then with the hard part, which is to say, okay, the world is as it is, contains all these phenomena that physicalism can't explain. How must it really be structured in order that this stuff can happen? Well, we ultimately decided to bear down on a number of historical systems that took some of these phenomena seriously and attempted to advance a different picture about how the world is. And that eventually became the middle book, Beyond Physicalism, Toward Reconciliation of Science and Spirituality. And this is where we really tried to pull all this together and say, okay, is there some central tendency here that we can detect given what we've assembled so far? And my answer to that in the next to last chapter is yes, we seem to be headed in the direction of some sort of an evolutionary panentheism.
Okay.
Now, what is panentheism? Well, traditionally, religious viewpoints come down to two main schools. There's the traditional theism of the Abrahamic religions, where there's a sort of all-powerful being who creates everything in some way, may or may not still have anything to do with it, but stands apart from it in some way. Then there's the pantheisms in which God is identified with the world as it is entirely. Mm-hmm. Panentheism is in between those two views and retains some characteristics of both, because the world is entirely saturated with God on this kind of point of view, but there's something left over, as in theism. God stands in roughly the same relation to the cosmos that we do to our bodies, let's say, something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And this was the kind of view that Whitehead, in particular, was developing in light of his understanding of the meaning of quantum and relativity theory, with a deep understanding. And it's the kind of view that several of our physicists are headed toward. And it's actually, panentheism really originated with things like Plotinus and Neoplatonism, the principal sources, and penetrated Christianity. By the way, one of our contributors to Beyond Physicalism, Lorelei Bernacchi, has written a book with a man named Phil Clayton on panentheism in world religions. There are panentheistic themes already identifiable in all of the major faiths. So the net of all this, in my opinion, is that we are within sight of an improved, scientifically based worldview, which can remain consistent with the deepest parts of our science. It's important to understand that physicalism, as conventionally formulated, is no longer in sync with contemporary physics. It's a creature of 19th century physics. This kind of a picture can be formulated, I believe, in a way that will be more consistent with physics, will help us to understand the hard problem about consciousness, will help to explain lots of these other things that we've talked about. And the basic picture was elaborated by James using Myers's model of the psyche, which James had done in The Varieties of Religious Experience. This is back in 1902 in his Gifford Lectures. James is clear about this, by the way. He repeats it in several places. I'm using Myers's model. Myers did this, Myers did that. The big thing for Myers that appealed to James was his concept of what he called a subliminal self, capital S, which is a larger consciousness in which the everyday consciousness is embedded. I'm trying to get my hands here. I can't really do it in the space available. But just as in those multiple personality cases that we talked about earlier, Myers argued, and successfully with James, that kind of a structure is actually present in all of us, that our everyday consciousness is embedded within some kind of higher consciousness or larger consciousness that includes more and that has what he called adits and operations of its own. That is, ways of getting stuff in and out and capacities for doing things that were inaccessible to normal persons. And by the way, it's worth pointing out here that these included some very peculiar but very well documented things. Savant syndrome. Myers was fascinated by savants, kids who can hardly do anything. They're almost totally dysfunctional, cognitively and psychologically, and yet they have these isolated but extreme skills. And let me give an example of how extreme these things can be. Oliver Sacks, neurologist, no friend of us, talks in his book, The Man Who Mistook His White Wife for a Hat, about the twins. These were kids, identical twins. These kids could not add and subtract single-digit numbers with any accuracy. That's the background for this. Well, one day, Sachs is sitting there with him, trying to have a conversation, and he accidentally knocked a box of matches on the floor. The kids looked at that pile of matches and instantaneously said, 111, 37, 37, 37. Sachs heard the 111, and he counted them, and there were 111 matches.
Wow.
Later on, he realized that they had done something more interesting. That's interesting enough, and I'll get back to it in a moment. They had done something even more interesting, which is to factor 111 in terms of prime numbers, 3 and 37.
Oh, interesting.
That led him to get out his book of prime numbers. He went back, and he started a game with them in which he gave him a prime number. And then he gave him a bigger prime number, and they, factorized the bigger one in terms of the smaller ones. And then they started exchanging prime numbers. And it wasn't long before they were exchanging numbers that were bigger than the biggest one in his book, which was like 12 digits or something like that. And they got as high as 20 digits before he called the game off.
Wow.
Of course, he couldn't verify them at that point. He just wrote down a few. And these are things that we do now with supercomputers. And yet these innumerate children were doing it.
Crazy.
Now, James applied that model to his study of religious phenomena in general, giving Myers credit for the theoretical background. But at the very end of VRE, Varieties in Religious Experience, he says, I will attempt to elaborate. There's an appendix actually in VRE, which he talks about how he glimpses further horizons in his subject and will attempt to elaborate them. So he spent about the last 8 or so years of his life doing that. And there were two main strands to it: his philosophy of logical empiricism and a book that he published in 1909, the year before he died, called A Pluralistic Universe. PU, let's call it. In PU, he takes the Myers picture for granted and says, well, let's think about this some more. And in the context, I should say, he was talking at Oxford, which at the time was the kind of big center in the UK, in England, for idealist philosophy, which was beginning to collapse. You know, it did collapse around the time of the First World War, mainly being replaced by physicalism, thanks to people like Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore. Not for any decisive philosophical reason. It's just that it no longer seemed necessary to think that way because physicalism was being so successful, producing all kinds of goodies, you know, that we could use in everyday life.
Yeah.
So it was more a matter of practicality. It's just kind of melted away rather than being disproven in any sense. James himself actually hated it in the forms that were then prevalent. So he starts to imagine that maybe there's a hierarchy of these more and more inclusive integrations, and that the higher consciousnesses, we don't know how many there might be at how many levels. There seems to be at least one in conjunction with most of us. Mm-hmm. But is there a highest one? And if so, what could it be like? What he hates is the idea that there's an all-inclusive consciousness of the Bradley or Hegel or who else? You know, absolute idealist types. Mm-hmm. Because then, you know, God would be responsible for evil.
Okay.
This highest thing is a God of some sort. He wanted it to be a more sort of like us kind of God that we could be comfortably intimate with. Mm-hmm. You know, not so different from us. So he liked the idea that this highest consciousness, even if it was really super powerful in ways beyond our imagination, still might have limitations. You know, it might forget things and fail to notice important things and stuff like that. And meanwhile, we down here below, sort of attempting to run our our lives in ways that will help God carry out his bigger purposes, that's what we should do. But we have power of our own, and we can certainly create lots of evil without blaming him for it. Mm-hmm. That was James's basic point of view. What I argued in this next to last chapter of Irreducible Mind was that's where things seem to be headed toward some sort of a idealism that allows for plurality in an important way, because we do, after all, experience ourselves as being very different and separate from this world that we share. All that's going to have to be explained somehow. Mm-hmm. There are lots of physicalists at this point, I think, who are being forced to admit that they don't know how to explain consciousness. But if anybody like me comes along and tries to get them interested in idealism, they will say immediately, well, look, you have exactly the opposite problem. How are you going to explain matter? And for a long time, I thought, gee, you know, he's got a real point there. And it was an obstacle for me for a long time. But somewhere in the course of working on Beyond Physicalism, I began to realize that it's not as forceful as it seems at first sight, because there is a little asymmetry in the explanatory demands placed on the physicalist versus the idealist. Mm-hmm. We know the physicalist demands already, and there's widespread recognition now that they cannot be met by physicalism. Consciousness just remains resistant. Now, what about matter? We know absolutely that consciousness exists because we have it.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only thing we really know is our own experience.
Mm-hmm.
Matter is something else. That is a construct. What they are thinking about is the classical construct of matter, which was elaborated over several centuries in an attempt to help us understand stuff that happens, the nature of the world,
Yeah.
which is now breaking down in relation to our experience of various kinds. The demand on the idealist is not to explain matter. It's to explain the regularities that the concept of matter was created to help explain.
Mm.
Yeah, in fact, our physicist, like Henry Stapp, says matter as classically conceived does not exist.
Do you view, I guess, the higher consciousness as part of almost like we're living cells within like a larger organism, or are you?
Yeah, I kind of tend in that direction. There's even a sort of branch of the idealistic community, panpsychist or pan-experientialist community, which seems to be gaining traction, by the way, in the world of philosophy, that talks openly about what's called cosmopsychism. That is, whether there is a mental aspect to the universe as a whole.
Do you personally fall into because I know a lot of religions kind of peg like a personal God with like, a personality and kind of how we should perceive like the guy with the beard in the sky, or are you more inclined to believe it's more of a, like a universal? I know Spinoza's God's probably not accurate because like, I don't think he believed in an afterlife necessarily that your consciousness goes anywhere, but like the universe as a whole is kind of, almost like creating consciousness to be aware of itself. Or do you find it more to be there is like an objective entity that we would describe as a creator behind all this? Or is it a little more abstract than that?
Yeah, I really would rather not take a position. What I feel confident about is the direction that we're going in,
Mm-hmm.
not about any final decisions as to what is really there in the end.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a long time in the future to get that far into it.
Mm-hmm.
But I do feel like things are converging. And to that end, let me just say a little bit about the last book,
Sure.
Consciousness Unbound, a little more about it. I mean, it carries forward the themes of both of the previous books. There's a first section, which is empirical stuff. We have kind of state of the science chapters on near-death experiences by Bruce Grayson, our colleague, on the rebirth cases. Haven't talked about them at all, but they're an important new dimension of evidence for survival.
Could you say a little bit about that? Because for me, it's always been such taboo. Like you go, oh, that's just some kid, parents suggesting their kid that they, they're their uncle or they're their great grandfather who was in the war. But I mean, and part of that question that I really wanted to ask you is through your research, if consciousness survives death, where is your mind before your life? I mean, in terms of, is it transferring from reincarnating over and over again as part of this larger plan? I know that's very kind of an unanswerable question, but in terms of people you've spoken to, research you've done, how do you fit reincarnation with that?
Well, this is one of these more ultimate questions that we're not in position to answer in any very definite way.
Mm-hmm.
Let me point out that you're also presupposing, as I tend to do, our conventional idea about space-time, space and time, space-time as a kind of pre-existing container for everything that happens.
Yeah.
That's one thing that is specifically rejected by a number of the philosophical worldviews that we are attempting to elaborate in a manner that's consistent with things like quantum theory and relativity. Anyway, the cases themselves, let me contrast them with the other thing that people are likely to have heard about, which is this past life regression stuff. People claim to be able to hypnotize people and get them to talk about previous lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, that's been shown to have clinical value, but its value in terms of establishing the reality of rebirth is not very good. The reason being that it's extremely difficult to get stuff in those cases that can be verified.
Mm-hmm.
And even if there can, where did it come from? It might have come from the person reading an article about, the person whose life is being described, person in the
Yeah.
past. So Ian Stevenson was the founder of our division at UVA, and he became aware of cases here and there in the world in which small children began to speak and act as though they were remembering things from a previous life. And in which, in some cases, it appeared that persons could be identified who corresponded to the child's narrative. So he went on a first expedition to India to look into some of these cases, supported by the Parapsychology Foundation in New York. And sure enough, he found, hey, these. Well, actually, he first wrote a prize-winning report for the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research, in which he summarized a number of cases that he found in the literature here and there. Ian was great about this. I mean, he was the master of digging stuff out of the literature. So he was already interested, and this first trip to India convinced him, yes, there are cases out there, and in fact, there are quite a few of them. And over the next 40 years, he and various colleagues looked into something over 2,500 such cases.
Wow.
In every part of the world, most commonly found in societies that have a reincarnation belief, but not exclusively in those societies. There are a number of American and European cases, for example, and some of those are quite good. Our current division chief, Jim Tucker, has kind of taken over for me, and Ian died in 2007. He is particularly interested in the American cases, partly so that he can avoid having to travel to these remote and sometimes rather dangerous, I must say, places that Ian went to. I mean, there was an aspect of physical danger to Ian's investigations that I don't think has been adequately appreciated. My God. Anyway, the evidence has several dimensions to it. First of all, the kids sometimes report living in some fairly remote place that can only be discovered. The previous personality can only be tracked down with some considerable investigative effort. Mm-hmm. And there may be big social differences between the families, which would have prevented them from having any dealings with each other. But the children can sometimes report people, names, events, can sometimes say where things are that had been lost in the previous personality's domicile or whatever. The children sometimes have unusual kind of behavioral characteristics that can be tied to the manner of death of the previous personality.
Interesting.
For example, a lot of these cases involve the previous personalities died violently in some way, either by being killed or in an accident or being bitten by a snake or something of that sort, mm-hmm. Or drowned. And the child will show a corresponding kind of phobia. So a little kid just freaks out when put in the bathtub or something like that. And it turns out the previous personality died by drowning.
Oh, weird.
Or another interesting one is a bunch of kids in Burma who hated the spicy Burmese food and wanted stuff like raw fish, and who claimed to remember being Japanese airmen who were killed in the Second World War.
How crazy.
Stuff like that.
Would you say the evidence for NDEs is stronger than reincarnation, or are they just two completely different sets of evidence that you have to look at?
Yeah, I don't think there's any sensible way of comparing them in a rigorous sort of quantitative manner. They're independently very strong, in my opinion.
Okay.
I mean, there are a lot of these rebirth cases in which records of what the kids said and did were made before there was any contact between the families.
Okay.
And in a very interesting methodological study that Ian did with a friend of ours, a Dutch guy, what they did was they compared the characteristics of cases between these most sort of rigorous cases with the independent prior record taking and so on with other cases in the database. And we now have a computer database containing coded versions of over 2,000 of these cases. Mm-hmm. And the point was that the characteristics of the much larger number of cases that lacked prior recordings were essentially identical with those of the best cases. So I think the cases in general are better than critics might like to think.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Oh, yeah, there's one more empirical chapter in Consciousness Unbound. It's about precognition.
Okay.
And the state of things in that area by a guy named Bob Rosenberg. And precognition is a subject that gives most people the most heartburn because it seems to have all kinds of implications for stuff like free will, determinism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you can report something that doesn't happen until next week, does that mean that the current state of the world
kind of just blows
that?
your mind? Yeah. I mean, a lot of this stuff, when you start going down it, is really can really twist you up mentally.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, have you, not to throw you off track again, but I mean, I feel like it's so vast and so complicated by itself and kind of turns everything on its head that it automatically is going to dissuade a lot of people from even going down that path because it's so different. And do you find that to be a challenge kind of in convincing people that, hey, these are phenomena that are really happening?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, it's part of that secular faith thing that I talked about earlier. And it applies to more than scientists. Most of us have grown up with this physicalism thing. Is like a kind of mythology about how the world is. Mm-hmm. We've all been steeped in it. It becomes very natural to think in that way, very hard to let it go.
Yeah.
And yet, the history of science mainly consists of rethinking some very basic things from a totally different point of view. Like, the Earth being at the center of the universe.
You can definitely identify times in history where this has happened and like the mainstream's moving one way, but some people are swimming upstream and they're saying, no, hey, we got to look at this different. So you would think maybe this is one of those opportunities.
Yeah.
And for the precognition thing, that's really fascinating. Is that something that's even as rare as all these other phenomena? Is it more? I mean, has it gleaned any insight into actually free will and all this other stuff that you've kind of taken note of in your own personal life?
I'm a strong believer in free will.
We're not all heading to one conclusion. We can't stop.
Well, it's hard to know about that. But I mean, free will is one of these things we presuppose in practice. Even people who write huge books denying the existence of free will. In fact, Whitehead had an interesting remark. He said, describing such people, he said, scientists animated by the purpose of proving themselves purposeless constitute an interesting subject for study.
That's good.
how I feel about that. That's a huge subject. I don't want to go any further in that direction. Bob's chapter is great. But I myself have slowly become convinced over years that once you abandon physicalism, which I felt compelled to do even with just psi phenomena I saw the interest, the conflict with conventional physicalism. But like a lot of people, I hoped and really kind of expected that some, little tweak someplace was going to make it all okay. Mm-hmm. But little by little, I've abandoned that hope and have now come to the conclusion that once you abandon physicalism, there's really no philosophical stopping place short of what amounts to practically its exact opposite, some kind of idealism.
Now, if I had to put you on the spot, and say, is there one, I guess, psi phenomenon or one case in particular that if you could try to convince someone to abandon physicalism and to look at this, what would you point someone to? Besides reading your books, which I think are excellent, what would you say? Like, hey, look at this. If you truly are open to new information.
I would strongly resist doing that.
Okay.
There is no one case or experiment that can convince everybody.
Okay.
It's the cumulative weight of numerous overlapping but somewhat independent kinds of evidence that represents the real case for the reality of these phenomena.
Okay.
Just for the hell of it, though, let me add one to things to give you maybe some heartburn.
Okay.
It's one that you and I both have maybe a special relation to. Catholic saints. There's a big literature related to miracles in Catholic saints, coming from the nearly secular trial type procedures involved in canonization. Those are quite rigorous. They're like secular trials, really. Mm-hmm. There's one case in particular of that genre in which the promotor fidei, the defender of the faith, was a guy who Prosper Lambertini later became Pope something or other, I forget, and was the creator of the standard system for canonization, the requirements for canonization. He presided over the case of one Joseph of Cupertino, a 17th century Catholic saint, who was known as the patron saint of flying, partly because this person, on hundreds of occasions, in the presence of thousands of witnesses, including sometimes skeptical and hostile witnesses, in good light, was observed to rise into the air. He would sometimes let out a shriek and rise up. And these were not subtle movements where is he on the tips of his toes or not? He could rise as much as 30 meters in the air, remain there for minutes or sometimes hours at a time, sometimes carry big objects with him going up. And all this was part of his canonization procedures overseen by Prosper Lambertini, who concluded at the end of all that. And by the way, the witnesses here were people who were, sworn to tell the truth and who understood and believed that if they lied in these circumstances, they were headed straight to hell when they died.
So they had no
lots of testimony in support of Joseph. Joseph is not the only such case, but he's the most extreme of all. That's what we call macro PK, macro psychokinesis. And that gave the physicists, by the way, in our group, a lot of heartburn.
because it was documented kind of from objective sources. It wasn't just this one guy saying it who really wanted to believe it.
No, it's thousands. Well, there are hundreds of depositions. Oh yeah, and the procedure discriminates in terms of quality of witnesses. The educational level, the apparent honesty, and objectivity, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
One of our colleagues here, a guy named Mike Grosso, has written a book about this called "The Man Who Could Fly." I strongly recommend it if you want to find out about Joseph and related things.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to read because I for a while ago read about certain saints and their canonization process and what kind of the miracles that were attributed to them. And there's some really fascinating ones, but I wasn't aware of that one, so I'll have to pick that up and read about it.
Yeah, no, it's a great story.
The overarching theme I feel like I'm getting from you is that there's a higher dimensions of consciousness, certain things we can tap into as human beings that we're not aware of. And these people who are experiencing these psi phenomena, do they have it's always viewed as they have a special talent, or is it all of us could technically reach into these areas, or these people are their brains, when you talk about filter theory, they've developed in such a way where they're able to kind of access this stuff more? What's the theory about why some people have it and some people don't?
Yeah, well, this is a very good question. And it's really the point I wanted to end on. This whole picture that we're developing, I alluded to it before, but let's talk more about it now. There's an applications side to this picture. That is, the picture we're advancing is one in which we do potentially have access to these higher potentials. If we can learn enough about the circumstances in which they become available, we can perhaps use that information in order to either improve the technologies we already have or invent whole new ones to help create or sustain those characteristics in our own brains.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're at the absolute beginning of this process. We know for sure that psychedelics of certain kinds can produce mystical experience. For the first time, we have the potential to study mystical experiences experimentally. And let me just mention in passing, by the way, the neuroimaging studies that have been done so far, particularly in about the last 10 years or so, have produced some very, to neuroscientists, shocking and surprising results. That is, everybody expected some kind of big increase in brain activity to go along with the increased intensity of experience in these psychedelic states. That is not what has seemed to happen so far. In fact, it's almost the exact opposite. A study involving injection of psilocybin and following what happened using fMRI in 2012 showed that activity was reduced everywhere, and especially in a brain system that's known to be closely tied to what you might call the everyday embodied ego. It's called the default mode network. Whole set of nodes, particularly in the midline brain regions and deep in the brain. The neurophysiology so far seems to go along with the descriptions in the mystical tradition about how you enter these higher states when you can eliminate the everyday ego and all the sort of ongoing chatter and all that. Meditation, a lot of that is intended to help you shut down the normal, constant, roar of everyday preoccupations.
If somebody wanted to, and I guess this kind of ties back in what we mentioned earlier about evil and some of the religious teachings about accessing these abilities and having demonic influence, and have you seen any evidence that that's a concern? That when you open yourself up to these dimensions, you don't really know what's there. It doesn't necessarily have to be, your God and your devil but there is something maybe that doesn't have your best interest, some kind of energy that's not friendly to you. Do you see that as
I think
legitimate?
that's a real thing. It's partly, again, just garden variety psychopathology. Psychedelics are way less dangerous when properly used than a lot of people have thought, but they're not entirely innocent either. And people who are a little, rickety to start with can be pushed over the edge. Same is true in meditation even. There's an increasing body of literature about how some people have bad effects from meditation, might even precipitate psychotic episodes, things of that sort. And there is some literature. Some of it goes back to William James. He talks in the Principles of Psychology about a case in which a young woman was apparently possessed by the spirit or something of a deceased, not quite neighbor, but a nearby person, a young woman. And Ian Stevenson had a couple of cases of this sort, and they're sometimes very unpleasant. And there is a small clinical literature about apparent cases of possession, not diabolical possession necessarily, but something nasty. It's certainly conceivable, in terms of the James type view of things, that there are things floating around out there somewhere that are nasty and don't have our best interests in mind. So, yeah, you got to be careful. One place where this really comes up, by the way, a lot of times is in connection with automatic writing.
Oh, okay.
People start doing automatic writing. And next thing you know, and my sister, who became a medium, she had some experience of this kind, where whatever was producing the writing started saying stuff that really alarmed her. For example, one time it declared that our grandfather had fallen in his apartment in New York. We were about 50 miles north, and that she needed to go there immediately to help him. So she got my mother to drive down there with her, and he was perfectly okay.
See, that goes into some of the warnings that, especially the Catholic Church gives, Christians give, about opening yourself up to this, and you don't know if the things are lying to you, tricking you, deceiving you. And it gets obviously a little creepy and concerning when that's happening, and you start ruling out, in other people's cases, like any kind of medical condition, psychological conditions, and it's nothing like that's coming up. And they're still getting these messages that are either harmful or kind of twisting them up a little bit. Do you recommend that people don't try to access these things because of these pitfalls, or do you feel like it's relatively safe?
Well,
it's got to be really rare, right, that this kind of evil, quote unquote, evil stuff is happening, because right, you have your 1% of paranormal side cases that are actually real, and then you have an even smaller sliver of that where actually something kind of harmful is happening.
Yeah. I just say be careful. If you're inclined to look into these things, do so, but be careful. And this applies also, by the way, to the other genre of automatic stuff, which is these, deliverances of higher wisdom from some other department of the universe. There's a whole big genre like this. It started back, I don't know when it started really, but became known in the West and by the middle of the 19th century. It's a big part of spiritualism, for example, where, someone opens himself or herself to an inner voice, which declares itself to be so-and-so and is going to use this person as a channel for delivering the higher wisdom that will save suffering humanity. You can imagine that's very seductive. And there are lots of people who would like to become known as that channel for that higher wisdom. There's a whole genre out there. And with that stuff, you got to be very careful. I mean, it's interesting. And there's a certain commonality to it that's kind of along the lines that we've talked about.
Mm-hmm.
But William James, in his characteristically pungent way, pointed out, by the end of the 19th century, that this stuff has really kind of peculiar characteristics. He described it as a peculiarly optimistic blend of philosophy and water. That is to say, it wasn't very sort of intellectually rigorous or anything like that. And his other sort of snide remark was that it seemed almost to all have been written by the same person. So generically similar.
Yeah.
One relatively good modern example of that is the thing called the Course in Miracles, which is basically dictated in automatic writing or automatic speech or something through a woman who was a scientist. And it's certainly one of the better specimens of that genre. Mm-hmm. I'm not all that familiar with it myself. But it starts off, for example, saying, this is a required course. Your only decision is when to take it, or something to that effect.
So for you, how evil fits into this and this darker side of things, kind of messing with, again, I know we're getting speculative here, but is it just this creative force, this higher dimension, the higher consciousness rather? Is it that it doesn't have control over these things? Is it part of itself that's just kind of, for lack of a better term, like a yin and a yang, kind of a balancing act between good and evil in the world? It's kind of a necessary thing, that's phenomenon that's there. Have you gleaned any insight from all these people who have had these experiences, who claim to have, seen or accessed higher levels of dimension, any kind of clarity in terms of why people who struggle with, myself included, with suffering, the problem, the kind of the distribution of it in life, sick kids, not necessarily what we do to each other, but that's a huge block for myself in terms of believing something actually up there cares, no matter what form that is. Does it give you more clarity mentally to think that, well, maybe this thing just isn't powerful enough to, or just can't control all that stuff, or it's just necessary? I know, because I think Eben Alexander described it as he felt it was like almost like a training ground for your soul to keep evolving to this higher self, higher consciousness. How do you see that?
Yeah, well, Eben is a lot further along than I am in terms of settled opinions about things. And of course, he had that fantastic experience. I'm a kind of practical guy down in the trenches here most of the time. And when I look around, boy, there's plenty of evil in the world, but I must say, I think we're responsible for most, if not all of it. And I'm not even particularly interested in worrying about, something like a devil or a really big bad guy of some sort out there in the ether.
Yeah.
To be perfectly honest, I feel like we're in a sort of race condition right now, in which if we continue as civilization on our current path, we are going to obliterate ourselves and possibly the entire planet in a relatively short time. How can we avoid that? I think one of the most important things is to find a better, but still science-based picture of the world that will naturally encourage us to reform some of our worst habits, to do things like form a real ethos that can sustain humanity and prevent us from exploiting the planet and killing each other and all that stuff. I don't want to speak about that anymore because it's too far ahead of where we are, where I am, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a little appendix at the end of Consciousness Unbound where I tried to say in as few words as possible where I think this is all headed. And that's basically the story that I try to tell there.
And do you personally, and it's a very, very personal question in terms of your kind of evolution of belief and where you feel, I guess, is there a purpose to life? Is there a purpose to us being here? And it's kind of a selfish question for myself, right? Anybody who watches somebody pass away and thinks the relationship, the journey that we had and that's now lost, and will you get to see that person again? Is there a reason I'm here? Is there a reason we're animals who seem to be conscious, who seem to start asking all these questions? And the problem with people who just simply don't believe in anything else is it's always struck me as odd that a universe would exist that can create or evolve creatures that then can mock their own existence and think how pointless all this is, and that yet we came from something lesser. Have you, just in a personal sense and trying to make sense of it all, formulated any opinions or beliefs about that?
Yeah, actually, I have. And I mean, this is not a matter of having proven that this is correct in some sort of scientific way, but I feel I resonate strongly to the picture shared by William James and Alfred North Whitehead and a number of our members, in which truth and beauty and goodness are fundamental to the universe. And our task is to cooperate with the highest being, whatever that is, in advancing us in that direction, overcoming our limitations as human beings and as civilizations, and marching us toward that all too distant future.
Very wonderfully said, I think. We've gone like kind of far over the time, and I really appreciate you giving that to us. I mean, I'd love to have you back on in the future to talk more about certain things. But if anybody wants to find out more about you, the work you guys are doing at the UVA, where can they go? What can they look up?
Yeah, just Google DOPS, that's our research unit, blank UVA, University of Virginia, and you'll go right to our website.
Well, thank you again, Doctor. I really appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you.